So today's lecture we're going to be talking about the second part of our GUI interfaces. So we're going to be bouncing back and forth between a Windows form example and a WPF example. So let's start with Windows forms. So here in our toolbox here we've got our various different categories, and we're going to take a look at menu first off. So we can just drag and drop this menu strip control over here, and we can just start typing how we want our menu to look. So maybe like file, and then a submenu would be exit, maybe another menu would be edit and find, for instance. And so you can see when I run this application, our menu just starts popping up here. It doesn't have any functionality, but we can treat these just like we would buttons. So I can come here to the find and double click it, and you can see here's the event when the user clicks that particular part of the menu. What you can also do is when you come in here, I can put an ampersand next to it, and now when I run it, you can see how it's underlined. And so that's when if I hold down the Alt character and press F, you can see it becomes a shortcut key to it. Go ahead and close this down. So that's a very simple menu control. We can come over here, we can take a look at all the properties for the various aspects. You can enable, checked, unchecked, so you can add in all kinds of different things. You can align your text, set font colors, just like most controls in your Windows forms. So the next one we want to talk about will actually be helping you with some of your assignments, and that's the month calendar control and the date time picker control. So let's come over here to common controls, and let's drag the date time picker control, expand that out a little bit, and then we've also got the month calendar control. And so we drag that out here. And so you can see the differences is they're both a way of selecting dates, but one is just sort of a collapsed down version of this. So if I click this, you can see it's the exact same control, except it just gives you a single date. Where this one you're going to allow for multiple dates. So you can see how I can actually select like a week, for instance. So when we come in here to our date time picker for a single date, you can see value right here is the date time that will get returned that the user has selected. So if I come back to my form here and say date time picker 1, and I highlight value, you can see it returns to us a date time object, and we learned about date times in the last lecture. So that's our date time picker. If we come to our month calendar control, you can actually allow them to have a selection range that you can return. You can set the min date. So generally you want to make this as small as possible. So if it only makes sense to select something from the last year of data, you wouldn't want this at 1753. You'd want to put it to the last year. Same thing with max date. You want to set those in to be helpful. But as you come through here, you can see you can set things like, what's the first day of the week. So I can change that to, any day of the week I want there. We can set the selection count. So if you only want them to select a single date, you would just set that to 1. We can come down here, so we can do things like show today, just different pieces of text. So you can say it just gets rid of that show today to false. And when we're dealing with our month calendar control, you can see if I say month 1 calendar dot, and here you can see you can access something like selection start and selection end, which return the date time. And so these ones you would use if you just wanted to pull out the particular date that was selected, because maybe if you only entered in one date, you can only pull out the start date. So that's how you would get the date out of the month calendar control. There's also something called a link label. So if I drag and drop that, this is where if you had a URL to access maybe a web application within yours, so open up Internet Explorer for instance, this looks like a link, but you access it just like a button. So I double click it, and then you could do any normal code. It's just the look of it makes it look like a link, but it acts just like a button. So the next thing I want to talk about is list boxes and checked list boxes. So these are the type of controls that you would use if you were going to allow for multiple selections. So we've got our checked list box and our list box. And so they work exactly the same. This one just has the items with check boxes next to them. This one just lists out the items. So they're both going to have this items collection right here. So if I open this up, you just add in strings that you want to be displayed. So when I click OK, you can see there's my different items, and then I can select any combination of these that I want for my checked list boxes. But now generally what you'll see here is just your selection here of just our normal list box. So let's go ahead and add in again some more items for our normal list box. And then for our list box, there's a few properties that we want to set based on how we want the user to select items. So the first one you want to take a look at is selection mode. And so it's currently set to 1. So if we run this, you can see that even if I hold down Control or Shift, it's only going to let me select one item. If I select multi-simple, and I come up here and I start selecting these, I'm not holding down the Control, but it's allowing me to do multiple selections just by clicking the list box. If I set multi-extended, this is going to give the normal functionality where I actually have to hold down Control or Shift to highlight multiple items. So if you want multiple selection, you probably want to set it to multi-extended. So another property we want to look at is selected item. So in our code, so this is list box 1. If we say list box 1 dot selected item, this is going to return us the object that was selected. We can also get the selected index of the item that was selected, or if we're allowed multiple selections, you can see we can actually pull out selected items, which returns us a collection, and so it's just an array. So from there, you know, I could select which item in this collection, or I could loop through this collection. Now I can also do things like .add. So if I want to add some items, I would say .items.add, and then I could add in another item to my collection. So when I run that, and you can see that when the form loaded, it went ahead and added on that. Sorry, when I click the link label, you can see it added on that particular item there. I can also do items.remove. So if there's a particular item you wanted to remove, you'd say items.remove, or remove at if you know the index of the item you want to remove. So the next thing we want to take a look at is combo boxes. So I'm going to drag and drop a combo box onto here. And so it also has an items property, which is the main property we're going to deal with, and it does exactly the same. It's just a list of strings that are all contained in as objects. And so now when we run this, we can see we've got our combo box, and so each of our items are allowed for selection there. With our combo box, it's a single selection, but how you want them selected, we've actually got a modifier here, let's see, called drop down style. And so right now it's set to drop down, but if we set it to simple, it kind of gives you a little bit different functionality where you could maybe handle the input here and then filter the selection of these various items. And you notice when I select them here, they actually become highlighted up above. So that's simple. You've got drop down, which we just looked at, and there's drop down list, which when this runs, you can notice I have to actually select one first, or I can actually start typing, you know, letters in here, and it'll find the characters, the item that matches the characters that I'm typing. So drop down style is what you'll set for your combo box. With the combo box, if I were to double click it, you get what's called selected index change. So as the user is selecting a different item here, the selected index is also changing. So every time you select an item, this method gets fired. And so I can just say combo box 1, and then I can pull out the selected item. So I can select the index, I can do selected item, or get the selected text. Now when you do selected item, notice that it's actually an object that's returning to you. So you'd have to cast that to a string, or in a later example, I'm actually going to show you how you can actually add objects, like an employee object, to a combo box and be able to select the entire object itself. So that's how a combo box works. Let's take a look now at a tab control. So we have this tab control on here. So that's going to be a container. So if we drag a tab control, what's nice about tab controls is if you have just limited amount of space, so you can see I can drag this combo box in here, I can do a label, And now I can go to the tab page 2, and it's just sort of like I got a whole separate window within this little tab control. Actually, that's probably a bad one to put on there. If I want, I can then add additional tabs on here. But it's kind of nice, so if you have a limited amount of real estate and you need to make it compact, this gives you a lot more real estate. Or what you can do is have, kind of like how we've done group boxes before, you can group similar items into the various tabs for the user can select or that they need to know about. So that's a tab control. So the next thing I want to take a look at is an example from the book, and this is on what's called visual inheritance. So I'm going to go ahead and just close this one down. And so this is figure 15.45. And so the idea of visual inheritance is this. What we're going to do, oops, sorry, wrong button, Control L, is we've created a solution here with a project in it. Now this particular project, let me show you. If I were to say File, add a new project, what they've done is they've actually created what's called a class library. And so a class library is never meant to be ran. It's meant to be compiled down into a DLL that another developer would then add to their project. So you would create a class like an employee class or something to that nature, compile it down to a DLL, give it to another developer, and then they could add that to their project and use it just like they had written the code in their project. Well, what they've done here is they've created this little class library and they've just added a window to it. And this window just has some labels and text boxes, has a button here that when you click it, it does this little message box. Now if I try to run it, you can see that it says, hey, this is of output type class library. It cannot be started directly. So what you really do is you just come in here and build this solution and it creates a DLL. So if we were to open up Windows Explorer and we go to, let's see, this is the book code examples, and this is figure 1545. So we go to chapter 15, example 1545, you see visual inheritance base. And if I come into the bin debug directory, here's the DLL that it compiled down to. So now I can distribute this DLL to other developers. So remember in .NET, this DLL is not executable code. It's actually intermediate language that then gets compiled down into machine language by the CLR. So we've now compiled it down into a DLL. So now let's open up this second example from the book called 1548 Visual Inheritance Form Test. And so now what they've done is they've added their own form on here. Let me ignore this error here. They've added their own form on. And you'll notice, I'm not sure why it didn't work here, but the goal of this is to come into references, add a reference, and let's browse. And you can see that this is the other project that we just built. Here's that DLL. So let's add that to our project now. Click OK. And so now I've referenced this DLL in my project. So what I can now do is, let me rebuild this and it should work now, is I've referenced that DLL and then I've inherited this from that DLL, that other form. And so this is a regular form that I'm now inheriting from that other form. So by doing that, all I have to do now, as you can see, I added it and then recompiled it. And so see these other buttons on here? See how they have these little lock on them? That means that they were inherited. This is actually something that they added on to this form. But they inherited everything else. So not only can you create inheritance in your classes, you can create a visual form of inheritance. So this is a regular form here, but we're inheriting our visual inheritance base form. And then we added on our own button click, which is this right here. So when we run this application, you can see for free we got this other button, and then we added on our own button here to run our application. So someone else could have built all this, we inherited it, and then we just had to add in our little more unique functionality. So you can actually have visual inheritance along with regular inheritance. So the next example from the book we're going to take a look at is this idea of user controls. So user controls, they're just a form of reusability, but they're visual rather than just creating classes that we can distribute. Now there's sort of a way of creating visual classes. And so what you can do in your code is you can right click and do add user control. And so that would pop up like this, and that's what they did here. And they created this clock user control. So here's this clock, and all they did was they put a timer on it, and it just ticks every second, and they just update the time. That's all this user control does. And then you compile your application, and then they went to their main form, and you'll notice if I come to my toolbox now, and so this is just a regular form, up here at the top you can now drag and drop user controls onto this form. And so what you've done here is you've created this user control, and it's just a visual class is all a user control is. So a lot of times in the real world you'll have to create some sort of like date control. So you have maybe you have to enter in a date range or report date, and you have to add in all this validation about the date to make sure the the start date is before the end date and that they've entered it in correctly, and maybe you need some other functionality. So you could have someone else write some sort of date control. You distribute that to all the other developers, and they just have to drag and drop that now onto their form, and so they've got all this complex functionality. And it's just a visual class. So you can see now, just like how I instantiate multiple employee classes, it's just instantiated multiple clock user controls is all it's done here. And you just drag and drop, and you can run with it. So now let's jump over to WPF. So here's just a little WPF form, and let's kind of drag and drop just some WPF controls that we had looked at with Windows Forms. So the first one, let's take for instance a combo box, and let's drag and drop that over here, and here's all of its properties. So in WPF it's a little bit more powerful what we can do with our combo box here. And so you don't add just strings like we did in Windows Forms. You can add any type of item that you want to our collection here. So when we come down, we've got this items collection that we can access. So right here we open up items, and it's got this little builder here for our user interface. And you can actually see now I can add in any type of object in there. It doesn't just have to be a string. So generally when you're doing a combo box, you'd add combo box items. So I click, I'm going to add a combo box item. And then in my combo box item, I can change its content like ABC. And let's say I add another combo box item, and we come down here to the content DEF, click OK. And now when I run this application and I open up the drop down box, you can see there are my two combo box items that I added. But again, I can add in any type of item I want. I could also add in a button, I could add in labels, I can add in anything I want, checkboxes, anything. See, I can add a button in if I want, and then I can change the button's content to some data. Click OK. Now when I run this, I'm going to have some combo box items, but you'll notice I also have a button in here called DEF, so I can actually handle click events from that button if I want to. Generally with combo boxes, you're just going to add in combo box items. So here's the XAML for that. So you can see in my combo box, it's just adding in these items to it. And so I can add in anything I want as items. Now for my combo box, there's different ways that you can set up the selection for it. But generally you'll just leave it as the default. So you can see I can pull out my selected items. I can get my selected index just like before. Again, you'll just need to go through the properties and just take a look at some of the basic ones that you can change through here. But for the most part, combo boxes you just kind of leave the same. And then so within the code itself, we can come over here, and now we've got this combo box item. And so if you want the selected index, you could just double click it, and you can see selected index change, and then I could say combo box dot, I can pull out the selected index, I can pull out my selected item. Now what you're going to notice here is that this is going to return type object. Well, it has to return a type object because I could have any kind of object added there. So when I pull back my selected item, if I know, I would have to check to see, let's just for this now, let's just say we did actually just add all combo box items. So if I actually want to get access all of the functionality, I'm going to have to cast this to a combo box item. Because this is an item, I'd have to cast it to a combo box item so that I could then say dot and get all of the attributes and properties associated with a combo box item. So just remember, you'd have to add that in to get to that exact element within there. So the next thing we want to look at is our list box. So let me drag and drop this over here and open it up. And so our list box, we scroll down, you notice we also have this items collection. And the main thing you would generally add is a list box item. So let's add that. I can add here, again, just kind of add in some text, scroll back down, add another one, add in some content to it, add another list box item. Again, just add in some content here. And so we can see we've got our list box. And now we want to change the selection mode. So we scroll down here. And for this, you can see it's set to single. So we click Run. And no, even if I hold down Control, I can only select a single item. And if I change this to multiple, and I click Run, you can see now I'm not actually holding down the Control button. So this, by setting it to multiple, it just allows you to select multiple items, but you don't have to hold down the Control or Shift key. If I do Extended, this is what you'd probably have as the normal functionality, where it only selects a single item until you hold down the Control button and then or the Shift, and you can start selecting multiple items. So that's the selection mode. And then from behind the scenes, we can just say list box 1, and again we can do selected item, which you'd have to cast that into the proper type, or you'd have selected items that you could loop through. So you could do something like for each, and remember this is a combo box item, so combo box item, and then we could say list box dot selected items. So this would pull out all of the selected items, loop through them, and add them to the item little attribute here every time, or variable every time we loop through each of the selected items. So let me go ahead and close this application now. And so now I'm going to reiterate all of the controls that we've done for Windows Forms, and this is an application I've given to you on Canvas. And so for this one, it's just a whole bunch of controls. And so when we run it, we're going to have this list box here. We can remove whatever item we have selected. We can click a button to show all of the selected items. Here we can type in and add items to our list box here. And we're also going to do the selected index change to show us when index is currently selected here. Here we've got a combo box that we're going to be able to add some items to. Then as we select an item, that selected index change event is going to get fired, and we're going to display the selected item. Over here we're going to look at something new called a tree view control that we can add root and child nodes to. So this is basically like Windows Explorer, where this is a way you could display the file system, and so we'll look at how to do that. And then down here we're going to look at a really common way of adding objects to a combo box. And so here we're going to add users to this combo box and how we display objects appropriately, and then how we can actually pull out a selected item, which is the selected object, and then how we can get that data out of it. So let's start over here. And so what we're going to do is for this add item click, so the users type something in here, and now we want to add the item to this. So in order to do this, we just say, okay, I'm going to access my list box, so listbox1 dot items dot add, and then I just access that text box, so text box item to add dot text. And so by doing this, it just pulls the string out of the text box and adds it to all of my list boxes. So the next thing we want to look at is the selected index change. So I just came over here to my events and I set up my selected index change. And so I'm going to reset this little label right here to blank. And then I'm going to set it to the selected index. So I just say listbox1 dot selected index dot toString. And so that'll now give us the selected index. And now if there are multiple indexes, you'd have to do something like this, where you actually pull out the collection of indices, and then you could loop through them and display all of the selected indices at once, based on how, if you had multiple or single items, allow for selection there. Here, if we want to remove some items from our combo box, the first thing we want to do is make sure that an item was actually selected. So if we look at the selected index, we can make sure that it's not a -1, because the user is not forced to ever select one. So now we can just say listbox1 dot items dot remove at, and pass in listbox1 dot selected index. So this will remove whatever item has been selected in our combo box. So let's go ahead and close that down. And so now let's show all of the selected items. So we can come in here and we can just say, hey, let's go ahead and now, I'll just paste this code in here. We can say access my selected list box. And you'll notice we've got a for statement that we're looping through all of the selected items.count. So for how many selected items we have, we're just accessing each item in the selected items collection, and we're just printing it out. So this is how you would loop through. Another way that you could do it is to use a for each statement. So for each string in listbox1.selected items, just print it out. Or you could pull out the whole collection of selected items and display it. So the last one here is just the clear so this is the adding combo boxes. So add some items here. So this is a really common mistake, is to forget to clear out some items from your combo box. And so you don't ever want to forget to do that, because every time I click this button, it would just keep adding additional objects in there. So don't forget to clear out the items. And then we can just say combo box.items.add and add in some various items to our combo box. Then we can handle the selected index change of our combo box. So if I just double click this, it defaults to our selected index change. And then I can just say combo box.selecteditem.toString. And so that'll just add in, A, B, C, or D into this particular label. Go ahead and minimize these. So now let's talk about this tree control. And so I've got this tree control that I dragged and dropped. And we want to be able to add root nodes, add child nodes, and then as you're selecting it, I just want to display what the selected node is over here. So first, let's take a look at adding a root node. So the tree view control is made up of what are called tree nodes. Whether they're root nodes or child nodes, everything is just made of what's called a tree node. And so let's create a new one. And so let's just say tree node, my node equals a new tree node. And now we want to set my node's text property equal to whatever the user typed into that text box for add root node.text. So we're just taking the text that was in this text box right here, and we're creating a new root node with that text to it. And then all we need to do is we access our tree view control. So this one's called tree view 1, and we say .nodes.add, and then we just pass in my node. And so this is going to add a new root node to the tree view control, because we're just saying nodes.add. So if you want to add in a child control in tree view control, they type into this text box, they click add child node. Now here's another way that we can instantiate a tree node. So rather than having to do it on 2 lines, you can just pass in the text you want into the constructor of your tree node control. So these are exactly the same, these lines of code. And so now what you want to do is we're trying to add a child node to whichever node was selected as a root node. So the first thing we do is we look at our tree view control and we say, hey, was there a selected node selected? And so we look and say, hey, was that not equal to null? So as the user was adding in root nodes, did they have one selected, is all we're doing here. And if they did, then we say treeview1.selectedNode.nodes.add. So we add to the selected node this new node that we just created. And then here, this just expands it out so that as we're adding in these lower little child nodes, it just keeps expanding our tree view control out. And we'll take a look at that in just a second when we run it. I'm also handling the tree view 1 after select control. So if we were to come over here to our properties, you'll notice that here in the events, after select, so after you've selected an item, I've handled this event, so all I can have to do is just say treeview1.select node, and I'm getting my own little local handle to this variable. Then I can access the text property and just add that to my label. So I'm showing, which one was actually selected. So now this next part here, what we want to do here is we want to add objects to our combo box here. And so in order to do that, I've created this user class. So you'll notice I've got an ID, a first name and a last name, a constructor, a non-default constructor that I can just pass in all that information, and then I have a property called ID that I can pull out that ID up here. And then I've also got this public property called display text, which concatenates the ID, first name and last name. And then I've also overridden the toString property that just concatenates the first name and last name. Now the reason you want to do this is if you're going to display an object into a combo box, you have to tell the compiler how it should be displayed in that combo box. So up to this point we had just been adding strings to our combo box. Well, it knows how to display strings, but it does not know how to display a user object. So if you override the toString method here in the combo box, when it says, hey, I've got now a user object, how do I display that? Oh, just call the toString. So in the text part of it, you'll just see it'll say first name space last name. So this is my user class. So now over here what I do is I just create 3 new users, and then I just add those items to my combo box, and it'll know how to display those user objects because I've overridden the toString property. And so what's nice about doing this is this selected index change. So when you select selected index, what I can now do is just take a look at my combo box. So the name of my combo box, let me minimize these, is combo box items. So now I can say combo items dot selected item, and you see how this returns an object to me. And so all I have to do now is cast this back into my user object. And as soon as I cast this back into my user object, I have all of the information available to me about this user. So now as far as the user is concerned, they're just selecting first name and last name. But there's this ID. So let's say this is a database ID. So this is, a unique ID that's been given to us by the database. So what we've done here is we've gone to our database, said, hey, select all of the users. It returns back this data. We then loop through it and add all of the users from our database. And now the end user has no idea that this is purely about a database ID. So this ID is meaningless to the end user. They just want to select first name and last name. However, to us, if we're going to say update this user's information in the database, we're going to need this primary key. So what I can now do is, now that they've selected an entire object, not just a string, I can just say dot, and sure enough, here I can just access the ID because I have this entire object's worth of data now. So there could be 50 attributes that I can now, maybe address and phone number, social security number, or ID, so that I could go back to the database and I know exactly which record I can update now. So almost always with your combo boxes or list boxes or anything like that, you're going to add to it actual objects and then override the toString property. So that's how you would do that. Now here I've got this button called Show Selected Item. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to do that same thing we did below. So we need to say, okay, I've got this combo box objects. I'm going to pull out its selected item. However, I'm going to have to cast this back to my user. Then I make sure that it was not null, that they actually did select an item, that an item was selected, and if it was, I just display that user's ID. So that's how I can pull that information back out when I click this button here. So now maybe I also want to be able to add items from a list. So what we can do now is you'll notice here I've got a list of users. So I've got a generic list of type CLS users. I create those same 3 users. I add those 3 users to my list now. And so now all I have to do is I can say, okay, my combo box objects, its data source, I can now set that to my list of users. So this is actually probably how you would almost always do it in the real world, where you would go to the database, you would select a whole bunch of rows from the database, get that data back, and then you would, for every row, you would instantiate a new object, and then you would keep adding each object to a list. So all of those objects are now contained in this list. And then all you have to do is bind this list to your combo box. So this is a form of what's called data binding. So if we were to run this, so let's come back to our tree control here so we can see A, B, C, and so I can keep adding root nodes. And then if I run this here, I can say add child node, and you can see how it expanded those out, and I can expand as many or add as many child nodes as I would like. So that's what our tree view control looks like. Down here we've got a blank combo box. So now if I add those items, remember that created them individually, and then you'll notice that it is displaying the toString property for each object. Now I can do add items from list that we just looked at, and you can see it looks exactly the same here, but now we've bound an entire list to this combo box. And now show selected item, you can see I'm pulling out the ID for which user that I've now selected, because I can pull out the entire object from that. Another thing that we can do is you'll notice that I've also created this property called display text. And so for a combo box, you can also set up this what's called display member. And so what you do is you set this to the property that you want. So rather than overriding the toString to display it, you're telling it to display the text you call this particular property. So the display member is this property, display text, which in our instance, it does the ID, first name, and last name. So now when I run this, when I add these items, you can see it actually is calling that property to concatenate the ID, first name, and last name. So again, this is almost how you would always do it in the real world. Pull a bunch of data back from the database, loop through it, instantiate an object for each row, and then keep adding each row to your list, and then bind the entire list to your data source. So let me close this down now. And so let's go over user controls. So what we've got here is an example that I've given you on Canvas. And so this particular user control, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look where this is my user control. So all I did was right-clicked and I said add a new user control. So I said add user control. And so when you do that, I then dragged and dropped some labels on here, and I also put a button on here. Now here's the thing, when you have a user control, it should only know about itself. It doesn't know where it's going to be used at, so always think of a user control as something that's self-contained. And then you raise events to talk to the outside world. So what I mean by that is you need a way of communicating that the user has clicked on seat 1, 2, or 3 in this particular user control. So what we need to do is the user clicks this button, I need to raise an event that says, hey outside world, seat 1 was clicked, or hey outside world, seat 2 was clicked, or this button was clicked. And so what I can do is I can create this control, and it's going to have public properties on it, and it's also going to have these events that get raised up that tell whatever form has instantiated this user control on it that certain events have occurred. So just like how we have our normal buttons that we've been using all along, and before we were handling the click event of our button. And so someone at Microsoft said, here's a button, and I'm going to create an event called click that I allow the user to pass in a method to that I'm going to call when the user clicks this button. Now, the word click, that could have been banana. It just made sense. They called it click. And so we can name our events anything we want. And so what we want to do is we want to create a new event that gets raised whenever a seat gets clicked. So let's go behind the scenes now, and let's take a look at this user control, and let's write some code now that the user will then use to raise events and handle these events. So if you remember, whenever you have events, how you pass in a method to that event is through delegates. So what we want to do is we want to create a delegate here. And so this delegate is the format or method signature for the method that's going to be handled this click event for our seats inside of the main form. So remember, with a regular button, we had a seat click delegate that returned a void and had sender and event args. Well, here's our delegate. We get to make up whatever we want. So whatever it means to raise this event called label click, or seat click, we get to invent this. So maybe the method that gets handled or passed into us for this label click, we'll just call this seat click delegate. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass back the seat number. So we're going to go ahead and pass back the seat number. So the method signature that in our main form that we're going to assign to the seat click event has to be void and has to have a string passed into it. And I think as we go through all of these different next steps, this will all make more sense, hopefully. So now we also need to create a delegate for when they clicked that seat button. So we'll do kind of the same thing here. We'll say public delegate void button click delegate, say string seat number. We'll just do kind of the same thing, or we could have this string message if we wanted. It can be anything we want. So now we've defined two delegates now that define the method signatures, so when we raise this event we'll know what method to call in our main forms here, because they will assign it into our user control. So now the next concept is we need to actually define our events. So this is us making up our own click event. So just before, like they made up an event called click for a button, we're going to make up an event called seat click event. Now for the syntax here, we actually pass in the delegate, so seat click delegate, seat click event, and that's the name of our event. So what we've done here is we've said, okay, we're going to be able to raise this event called seat click event, and when we raise this event, the method that we're going to call has to have the signature of seat click delegate right here that we defined. And we're also going to do the same thing. We're going to create another event in our code called button click. So button click event. So we've created an event called button click event, and it's of type button click delegate. So let's come down here now. And so what I've done is I've had the same label click event right here. So it's called seat click. So any label you click on, it's going to call this single label or the single method here. So what I can do now is I can get a handle to whatever label got clicked, just kind of like we did with our tic-tac-toe. And so let's say label and sender. So whichever label got clicked is going to get passed in through the sender object. And so now we have a local variable of which label got clicked. And so now what we need to do is we need to raise this event up and handle the seat click event. So what we're going to do now is we're going to make sure that the user did actually assign to us a seat click event delegate method. So this right here, just remember how if we dragged and dropped a button onto our Windows form, we never had to actually handle the click event. Well, they don't actually ever have, we're not forcing anyone to handle this seat click event here, or this button click event. So we have to actually make sure that this isn't null, this event right here. So we just say if seat click event does not equal null. Now what we can do, if this event is not null, we can say seat click event, and then we can pass into it, we can say mylabel.tag.toString. Now what I've done is over here for each label, I've actually set the tag property right here to the label text. So that's the seat number. I could have also just accessed the text, but I wanted to teach you about this tag property. Now tag is of object type, so you can, not just a string, but you could put any piece of information here through an object. And so I just accessed that tag in order to give me which seat was clicked. So now the user, just like when we had a button click, we assigned it which method we want it to call when we actually click that button. Well, here the user on the form has assigned to us which method to call in their form when a label is clicked. So all I have to do is say seat click event and then pass in that seat number. And because they've passed in the method, this is the same thing as calling the method in their form. And then we're going to do the exact same thing down here, except we're going to call button click event and pass in a message to them that says the user clicked this button. So now let's tie it all back together. So over here on our main form, what we're going to do now is we can just drag and drop this user control onto our main form here. And so now that I've dropped this control on the main form, there's a few things we can do. So let's go ahead and save this. So on my user control now, if I were to come over here to the events, what's kind of neat about the way that they've done this in the events is that, let's come up here. So I've got these events. One's called seat click event and one's called button click event. So if I come over here and scroll down, sure enough, here is seat click event. So all I have to do is double click this and it's going to create the code that says control my user control seat click event. And so it ties those together, and it did it in that designer file behind the scenes, just like for a button click. Let me actually go ahead and undo this. And so another way that we can do that, so that's visually how you can do it, but you can also come in here and manually do it. And so let's manually go ahead and assign it. So I have this control, my user control, that was what it was called when I dragged and dropped it. And I can access that seat click event, and now I need to assign a local method to this event. And you'll notice that I have already actually created one called control, seat user control event click here. So I can just pass that in. So I'm saying whenever a label seat is clicked on my control, I want it to call this method. Now you'll notice that it returns a void and it gets passed in a string. So the seat number gets passed to this method, and then I can just display which seat was displayed. Now over here, this is actually a message. We changed it. And so I can take this message and I can assign that message to this status. And so this is when the button gets clicked. So now if we run this, we've got all of our events wired up. Oh, we forgot to instantiate that. What did I mess up here? So I'll just run this other example. And so we've got our label clicks here. So now when I click this label, you can see that event gets raised and we have whichever button was clicked. And so again, this control doesn't know that it's contained within this form. And so all it's doing is it's just raising the event saying, hey, outside world, these particular labels were clicked or this button was clicked. And you do that by raising these events. So that's a Windows Forms example. Now I'm going to do a really simple example now, but I'm going to do it in WPF. And so if I run this example, all it does is it has a WPF form, and this yellow area is a control that just pops up a message box. I just wanted to show you how to do it. So I've got this user control with a button click that just says hello. And so again, I just came in here and I right clicked and I said add a new user control. And so user control, and then I just drag a button on here and I changed the background color to yellow so it was easier to see where that control was. And now I saved that and I came onto my main form here, and let me go ahead and I'll just go ahead and delete this. And so all I did now is, you'll notice here's my user control. You can just drag and drop it and it's going to stick it in there for you, and then you can run it, and that's how you would do it in WPF. And so you can have that code reusability, and you can drag as many user controls on here as you want. So that's the WPF version of what we just saw with Windows Forms.